This is Creating a Family. Talk about foster, adoptive, and kinship care. Welcome back to our regular listeners. I truly mean that. We would not exist without you guys. And a special welcome to our new listeners. We hope that you will become a regular, so stick around. I'm Dawn Davenport. I am the host of this show as well as the director of the nonprofit creatingafamily.org. Today, we're going to be talking about should you consider adopting a child of another race or ethnicity? We will be talking today with Dr. Gina Samuels, who is an adult transracial adoptee and a professor at the Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice at the University of Chicago. She is also a faculty director of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture at the University of Chicago. Her scholarly interests include transracial adoption, mixed race, and multi-ethnic identity formation. We are also honored to have Dr. Samuels as the chair of the Creating a Family Board. Welcome, Dr. Samuels, to Creating a Family.
Thanks, Dawn. It's great to be here.
So we're talking today about families who may be considering transracial adoption. So if you are a white parent, are there different issues you need to consider depending on the race of the child you are considering adopting?
I would say yes and no. I think, to ask yourself, what is it about transracial adoption that you imagine? How many other families do you know who have done that, or parents who have been through that you have maybe talked to? What are you worried about and what are you assuming? And so I think there are different assumptions that just generally in society that we have about how different racialized groups experience race, experience racism, what's the big issue for them. And I think this comes to a head mostly with regard to Asian kids and biracial kids, for whom I think a lot of white people think we don't really experience the same amount of racism, perhaps, as people probably automatically assume that maybe Black people do. And that just is not true. And so I think a lot of the ways in which white parents or prospective parents understand how race and racialization operate for different communities can really show up in their parenting and what they imagine they have to prepare their kid for and what they think they might not have to prepare their kid for, and therefore the experience or difficulties or ease with which that child then is prepared for going out into a world where they'll be racialized.
Is there a difference between transracial adoption and transcultural adoption?
Yeah, I would think yes, because those words are different. So even though in US ways of talking, we oftentimes mix and match things like race, culture, ethnicity, nationality.
Yeah.
And so there's a sloppiness with which we, oftentimes I'll be asked, like, what's your nationality? I'm like, American. I'm a
Yeah.
citizen. We are all of us citizens, and all of our nationality can be American, but we all are different with regard to our cultures and with regard to our ethnicities and with regard to our race identities. And so getting really clear about like nearly everyone here who has been here past two generations is probably multi-ethnic. Most white people are multi-ethnic. Certainly, nearly all African Americans here whose families have been impacted by legacies of enslavement are multi-ethnic and likely multiracial. And so just how we think about how race and culture are not the same thing, nor are the same thing as ethnicity, shows up also in parenting. So I think for a lot of Black people, we think about race. And for Asians and Latinos or Latinx populations, even Native Americans, we think in terms of culture. And so all of us have a race, all of us have a cultural orientation, all of us have ethnicity, certainly as part of our backgrounds. And so there are differences because it shapes then what we prepare people for, what we think people need. Culture is about language and foods and aesthetic and what you find funny and just kind of your view of the world. And race is not that thing. Race is something that we've created to divide people up based on appearance, but is something also that based on a person's appearance, you are stigmatized for. You can be separately stigmatized for culture. You could grow up saying you're Black, but have no connection to Black culture. You could grow up saying you're Chinese, but you have no connection to Chinese culture. So these things are very, very very, very different and operate always in our families, in our adoptions, and then also in terms of how we experience the world through a racial versus a cultural lens. So that certainly is then also true in adoption.
Let me interrupt shortly to ask, did you know that we have a podcast every Sunday, a different podcast every Sunday called Weekend Wisdom, where we answer your questions? Please send in your questions. And this is a short form podcast. Well, in 5 minutes or thereabouts, attempt to answer your question. So send us your questions at info@creatingafamily.org. Most parents would say that they're hoping to raise a child to have a healthy self and racial identity. How do they differ? Our self-identity versus our racial identity. Seems like there would be a fair amount of overlap as well.
I think for many people of color, there's a lot of overlap. I think for a lot of white people, there is an unconscious overlap. But certainly for, seeing yourself, race is one part of that, just like gender is a part, sexuality is a part, class, religion, region, these are all parts of how we are located in the world, and therefore then how we experience ourselves and how other people experience us, what's a possibility for us. And so I would hope that most parents come to understand that for people of color to be racialized is a huge part that is put on us, that's not voluntary. And that is a part of how oftentimes we see our larger selves, sometimes in not so good ways, that many of the stereotypes around race have prescribed understandings of who your self is. Racist ways of sort of understanding that if you're Black, you're supposed to know how to dance, or if you're Asian, you're supposed to be good at math. All these kinds of stereotypes that we essentialize speak to not just what your race means, but also who you are as a person and your capacities. And even though we know that is wholly scientifically untrue, many people still believe these things and hold you to these expectations. And so
society believes these things sometimes.
Totally.
And that influences what we believe.
Right. And so then you have people going around thinking, not only am I maybe not Asian enough, Black enough, Latinx enough, but like there's something wrong with me as a broader person, not just my race or not just my culture, but that as a human being, I have this deficit because of how other people are interpreting my appearance.
You mentioned that white people, and in this case, parents, there is an overlap between a white person's self-identity and racial identity, but it's unconscious. What do you mean by that?
So I think part of, living in a society that centers and privileges whiteness is that one of the privileges of it is that you don't have to think about it. The whole world uses white people, white skin, white aesthetic as the default. Princesses are just white. Kings, queens are just white. Fairies are white. People, there's all the futuristic kind of portrayals of where we're going in the future are predominantly white. And so it's not brought to your attention all the time in the same way as is for those of us who are not white, who are in bodies that are not racialized as white. And so if you ask your average everyday, not academic-y person who hasn't been invited to consider this, a lot of times how that will show up is white people say, well, I don't think I just am normal. And it's like, yeah, that's the point though. You're just normal. Like what are the rest of us not abnormal? And so it's an insidious part of white supremacy that what's endemic to it is that white people get to operate and move through the world wholly unconscious to the ways in which the whole entire world is structured, that they are the default normal for everything. Much in the way that, the male body has oftentimes been the default way of talking about medical circumstances and diseases and all these kinds of things. We do this not just with race. So I think that that's a blind spot for a lot of white people because their whole life has given them a disability to be conscious to the whole rest of the way in which the world operates for an increasing majority of people. I think one of the biggest challenges for those of us who operate in this space to try to work with white parents and just white practitioners or white people generally, to really sort of convince people that there is this other world. And so that part of that unconsciousness is also an overgeneralization that normal is true for everyone, that's relevant to everybody. And why can't you just not make race important like I do? And it's like, well, but part of white supremacy is that I don't get to do that. You do. And so it's this weird sort of circular logic that you have to break through with many white parents and just white people often many who are very well intentioned and would not identify themselves as white supremacists, that we all operate in this world and that white people have been harmed by that, by the ways in which their childhoods and developmental circumstances and their environments have not called attention to the daily ways in which they are at best not harmed and possibly advantaged, quite probably, in unknown ways, even to them, just because of the skin they're in.
And why is this important for a white parent who is considering adopting a child of color? Why is it important for them to realize that they're unconscious of how race plays out in their own life?
Because they're raising a child for whom their experience is irrelevant. And they're raising a child for whom that child's race is going to constantly be brought to their attention. It is constantly going to be a feature of their life, and that is actually going to potentially bring harm. And so, if you're unaware of that, you put your child out in a world that is going to experience a world that is not always a safe place, where you are not entitled to safety, where you are not entitled to a lot of the privileges that I think white people take for granted. You do not get to be an individual judged on your merits. And so it's actually, I would argue, a form of neglect, of parental neglect, to not consciously think about how do I prepare my child in the same way as we, in different periods of our society have done stranger danger, and how do you, protect your child from other harms that any parent would want to protect them from. That racialized trauma and racism is another kind of harm, and it's real, whether a white person or parent has ever seen it, ever experienced it. It is real, and it happens to all of us. It happens way younger than I think a lot of white parents expect it to happen, from very close up, oftentimes from our own relatives and friends and pastors and all kinds of places that are really close up. And if you're not ready and haven't prepared your child for it, the hurt is a lot deeper. It's going to hurt anyway. You can't prevent it, but there's ways in which then, if you've not prepared your child, they're out there doing that by themselves without your protection, which I would imagine most parents don't want to have happen.
If you are enjoying this podcast, you will love a free guide that we have at Creating a Family called Strengthening and Supporting Your Transracial Adoptee. You can get this guide by going to bit.ly/transracial guide. That's bit.ly/ all one word together, transracial guide. It is a terrific resource, and I think you will really like it. So check it out. What are some of the issues that parents should think about to determine if they're the right family that should adopt across racial or ethnic lines?
Yeah, I think that's hard because it's different for all families. But I would start with, why do you want to do this? What about you and your life and your lived experience suggests that you have the resources and the capacities to raise a child who does have an entirely different racialized experience than you? And I don't think that means that the answer is always that you don't, or just because you're white, you don't. But I think being willing to ask some of these hard questions of yourself, asking some of your friends what they think of you. Your child should not be the first whatever in your life. I oftentimes say, so if you're looking around and you see that your church or your social situations, and I'm talking not about like who your barista is at Starbucks or who is the, person who is your doorman or woman in your apartment, but rather like your really close friends or the people that you would call if something really awful happened, or the people that you call when something really great happens. If there is no diversity or really limited diversity in that friendship group, that might be a little bit of a flag for me. And that doesn't mean absolutely not, but that means that, your child is going to enter into a social circumstance where they're going to be the only, and that's a really hard life. And so if you are somebody who lives a pretty white existence, if you do live out wherever, like I do in North Carolina in my cabin, you might want to think about what would that be like for a little kid to be there? What will that be like for a teenager to go to that high school? And if some of the answers you're getting is like, wow, they would be one of two, one of three, one of four, then I would say maybe now's not the right time. It doesn't mean never, but now's, to do that kind of assessment, I think is really, really important. If you feel like your family is going to be really reticent to embracing a child of color, that's a big deal.
Hmm.
To have a grandparent that won't acknowledge your child or be harmful means that then you're adopting not only a child of a different race that's going to have this as an issue that they're going to have to work through. And when they explain why they're dragging around white parents instead of parents that look like them, now you also have to make a decision about what you want your relationship to be with your own mother, your own father, your own brothers or sisters, your aunties and uncles, et cetera. So I just think there's a really serious and sober assessment that needs to happen that is a downer when you're excited about being a parent. And it's not the thing that most people would want to do. But I do think I would argue with any parenting, you should be doing this, but certainly and especially adopting across race.
And I'm assuming that just because there are more BIPOC children available for adoption is not alone the right answer as to why you want to do this.
No, that's not the reason. That goes into kind of the white supremacist, white savior, I'm going to save and rescue. And that oftentimes is more about the person who's considering adoption rather than what it really is going to mean for this child. And so most of the children in foster care go back home to their parents. So that's a narrative that I think lives as a marker for excusing a thoughtful and careful decision. And even if it was true, it still doesn't preclude doing some really serious auditing, racial, ethnic, and cultural auditing of your family as to whether or not you are that person who should
Right.
be contributing to that or helping to, ameliorate that issue.
Mhm. And the same would be said for domestic infant adoption.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm. So, what should parents be prepared to do in order to help their kids develop a healthy sense of self and a sense of racial identity? As you've already mentioned, those two are intertwined. So, you've talked about some of the questions that parents should ask themselves to determine if they should be considering. But what should they be prepared to do if they think, okay, I think I can do this, but I'm going to need to make some changes?
Yeah. Well, a big one, like be prepared to move. Be prepared to move. Where you live now may be great and you may love it. It may be really great for you, but it may not be really the best neighborhood or city or town for a child of color. And, not all people can just move like that. So that could then loop you back to, am I the right person? Are we the right family right now in our life where our jobs are or whatever the situation is? But you don't want to get into a pickle where, of course, as a baby, if you're adopting infant, it's not an issue where you live. But in a couple of years, it's going to be perhaps. And so, how open are you to making that drastic of a move in terms of literally where you live to kind of recalibrate? Now you're a multiracial family. And
Mm-hmm.
so, where will be the most safe and nurturing space? And I would argue there really isn't any safe or totally nurturing space for multiracial families. There aren't multiracial sides of town and all that kind of stuff. But I think there are better places than others for kids to grow up, to see mirrors of themselves, to have access to all kinds of family configurations. So I would say be prepared to at least talk about and think about, could you move? And if you can't, then to think about, like, what would it mean to send our kids to a different school than what we think is a good school? Like, how do we define a good school?
Mm-hmm.
I think this is a big one with a lot of white people. And as an academic, it's a big one for a lot of people of middle class and upper middle class of any race, is how do you define a good school beyond just academics? And the number one thing that will tank your kid, even if they're really smart and academically inclined, is having a really crappy experience at school with all the social and emotional stuff that happens at school. And so, how might you, as a transracial adoptive family, if you're especially not able to completely move to a different neighborhood, perhaps need to consider a very different school than you otherwise would, so that that school context can play a role as part of your child's community and access to kids, teachers, diverse, not just their own, but like ideally a wide spectrum of folks, so that your child can have that as a lived experience. But I think the school thing and the moving, the residential thing, which of course are also connected if you're intending public school,
Mm-hmm.
are really interconnected. Churches, social groups, your friendship group. How much are you willing to expand your own friendship group so that your kid sees you having friendships and relationships with people on your own with adults who look like your kid. And
Hmm.
that it's not just, offerings to your kid as like, here's a whatever for you to see, but that these are like genuine friendships that you have with people that are meaningful for you as a parent. And so I just think pretty much everything is on the table, as is true when you parent, but it's also another lens that you look through in terms of race and racial safety and racial nurturing and cultural nurturing.
Well, and the more you diversify your life, the more likely you are to form friends of your child's ethnicity or race,
Absolutely.
because that's how we find our friends. Also, seeking out professionals that you patronize, your doctor, your dentist, your dry cleaner, your whatever, the people that you do business with, making sure that that is also diverse.
Absolutely. The art in your home. If you're Christian, the sort of our ornaments that you put on the tree, the ways you talk about television shows, what you say is beautiful, who you go up to the store to ask questions when you're lost, who you naturally talk to as strangers out in your community. Like there are just a billion gazillion things that if you're not doing these things naturally, you should ask yourself why. And then think about how do you shift? How do you really shift to operate more fully in the world with a fuller spectrum of people?
Mhm. You mentioned this already, but adoption is a family affair.
Mhm.
So, how should a prospective adoptive parent prepare their extended family members for the adoption of a child of a different race or culture? And I guess a subsection of that question would be, how do we know if our extended family is willing and able to be a good grandparent, a good aunt, a good great aunt, or whatever, uncle for this child? So those are two separate questions. Let's start with the second one, which is how do we know if our family, I mean, sometimes we do know.
Yeah, I
We
was going to
just,
say. But sometimes it's part of that white privilege stuff of like, you may have not really paid attention in the same way.
oh, that's just Uncle Joe
That's just,
spouting
he's just
off.
being ridiculous. He just says these things. You shouldn't take him seriously.
Exactly. Nobody, takes him really. He's not really going to put on a white sheet. Honestly,
Yeah,
he's not, that
just
type of
joking.
thing. Yeah, he's just joking, that type of thing.
Yep. And so I think, some of it is some people really do know. And then you don't need to ask or have these conversations. You should trust your gut about this. If you think
Yeah.
already that it is, then you're probably right. But if you really don't know, that's also part of kind of white privilege of that you haven't had to know. And your safety and your comfort hasn't been in survival, hasn't required you to take seriously Uncle Joe. Because Uncle Joe isn't going to do anything to you. You're white. But what is Uncle Joe going to say and do in your child's presence? And so I think there's some of these things that you can just do as a scan. If you're partnered, trust me when I say your partner may be really clear, a little more clear about your family, and you may be a little more clear about your partner's family. So be
Yeah.
open to that conversation. And if you're not partnered or you just, both of you are kind of like, oh, I don't know, then talk
Hmm.
with them and say we were thinking about this, and obviously it's our decision. It's my decision as a parent to adopt or not, so it's not my parents decision, but talk with them about like how would you feel about that, how would their friends feel about it, etc. It's just this huge conversation that I think it's important to have. And then I think with that it's important to take people seriously if you adopt and they're like, oh no, it'd be really great, because I think these things change. If you adopt as a baby, it's different to have a little baby that's brown in the family
Hmm.
to then have an adolescent that is brown in the family, that then is different when that adolescent becomes an adult and has potentially their own children and their own dating choices. I think a lot of people don't think about like, oh, we're actually shifting the racial composition of our family going forward into generations potentially if they
Hmm.
have children. So as much as you can, at least in the short term, have these conversations with parents, your extended family, your whatever, and then keep your ears open in a way that you didn't before. Don't dump that on your child to tell you that they don't like the teasing. Assume that that's not good, and be as protective of your child around racial jokes and race teasing and all that kind of racist stuff as you would if they called your child fat, ugly, stupid, or anything else that you would not feel okay for a person, any person, to call your child. That joking about race is as hurtful, if not more hurtful, because of the legacy that that has. And your child is watching you as to whether or not you are a safe person with regard to such a huge part of your life. And so you may need to be prepared to have a very different relationship with family members, which is really hard.
Hmm.
But, talk to adults who have parents who chose somebody else other than them as a child. Once you become a parent, you can't choose other people over your kid. You
Hmm.
can't. And when you do, there's consequences for both that child and the relationship that you have with that child going forward into their lives. And kids know whether or
Hmm.
not their parent is okay to come and tell that they were hurt or harmed with regard to anything,
Hmm.
really. Kids know.
Yeah. Something that I hear from transracial adoptive parents is the realization that they have to stand up to a
Yeah.
family member that perhaps they've not stood up to before because it's
Yep.
not accepted to, well, in our family would be mouth off, I don't want a kid to mouth off to me, that type of thing. So it's not acceptable. And they have to be prepared to stand up to Uncle Joe or even worse, their own dad and say, you know what? That joke's not funny and it's not okay. I can't have you do that around my kid. And that doesn't go over well very often. And it's hard to do if that's not been a part of how you have interacted
Yeah.
with your extended family or your parents.
Yes, absolutely. And there are times where this gets so hard that sometimes it could be helpful to see a therapist and work on what that issue is, because that issue is probably much larger than just about speaking up about race. Like
Such a
oftentimes
good
these
point.
dynamics are much deeper and bigger and more extensive than just saying to your parent or whatever, brother or sister, whoever, don't say that in front of my kid. I don't like that. And so, yeah, I think those are hard dynamics. It can sometimes be helpful to go seek professional assistance to think through, how do you operate in this family? What are the boundaries that you
Hmm.
place with your family? When do you say this in front of your child and then maybe follow up later with the parent also and say, look, I'm not trying to embarrass you. This isn't about you. I'm trying to protect my child, and this
Hmm.
isn't okay. And I know we've done this in our family before. This is how Uncle Joe is, but it's now not okay. And every time this happens, I'm going to speak up.
Hmm.
I'm going to speak up. And so, it's not just a one and done thing. It's a kind of
Yeah.
recalibrating all of our relationships in our family to make space, safe space for a kid of color to be in a white family that has not had that in them
Hmm.
before it. So,
And didn't ask for it.
and
The
didn't ask for
extended
it.
family did not ask. This is uncomfortable for
Yeah.
some extended family members. I didn't ask for this, and you're the one who did it.
Yeah.
So
And
yeah,
so then you got to be prepared for, okay, you didn't. And so then what's the ultimate, if you get in that, there certainly have been families I know that they don't go to Christmas holidays. It's gotten that
yeah.
extreme,
Hmm.
and hopefully most families can work it out. And there are professionals that can help families to work this out. It's not immediate. These things are not fast. But in the meantime, while you're working it out, how do you make sure your child is not having to work that out with the family and be the target of harm? Like, so what are you going to do in the meantime? What's the plan for what you're going to do in the meantime so your child doesn't have to sit there and take racial abuse while Uncle Joe is learning to be less racist, at least in front of your child?
In front of you, you probably aren't going to fundamentally change. Although sometimes, and this is not a reason to, you shouldn't go in assuming this will happen. But I know so many occasions that people do change. It's all of
Yeah.
a sudden, wait a minute, this is my grandchild. So the things that I've always thought, this doesn't impact, this is not my kid. And my grandkid is not that way. My grandkid is quite a bit like me. And so it's not all bleak in that sense. We do see people making changes. It's just that you can't give a guarantee.
No, you can't. And you have to insist that they change. So you also can't think that you
Yeah.
can just do nothing and it's going to magically, a light bulb's going to go off in grandma's head and she's all of a sudden going to become multicultural. Like, it takes work and
Mhm.
vigilance. And in the meantime, as a parent, thinking through, how do I not ask my kid to be patient while grandma changes?
It's not the kid's responsibility to change
Not their
grandma.
responsibility, or to train the parents. That's
Yeah.
not the kids' responsibility to explain and justify that racism is happening. That's not your child's responsibility. And
Mm-mm.
so I think, back to your question, like, who shouldn't? If you don't believe that racism is real, you absolutely should not be adopting across race. You shouldn't. If you really do question that, that's going to be such an impediment to taking your child seriously when they do come to you and say this happens, that this is just probably not for you.
And that is true regardless of the race of the child you are
regardless,
adopting. Yeah,
regardless.
because I think that there is, we talked at the beginning, a belief that most people in the US would accept that Black people are facing racism. There are probably people who don't believe that, but I think there are a lot of
Most
people,
people are more inclined to believe that.
yeah, are more inclined to believe that. But if you're adopting a Hispanic child or you're adopting an Asian child, those groups also, the prejudices they face may be different. In fact, they probably are, but it's still impactful.
Absolutely.
So, how do you find, as far as developing a healthy racial identity, we are told that our children need to have role models in their life that racially mirror them. How do we find role models that mirror our children, if that is so important?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think this goes back to the question of like, what are you prepared to change? That this shouldn't be first you adopt the kid and then you go out shopping for people of color. Like that's, as a person of
Mhm.
color, that's always offensive when people are like, hey, will you come meet my kid? And I'm like, that's so weird. No,
Well, yeah,
I won't.
will you be my friend? I need a Black friend. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just weird for everybody involved. It's
Yeah.
especially weird for the kid. It's weird for the person of color because it's like, okay, your kid isn't going to automatically like me, and in fact, might reject me because they're going to know what you're doing. Because this is all of a sudden like some brown person that's come into their world for no reason whatsoever and doesn't even really know my parent. And so I think a better way of thinking about it is like, how are you committed to really shifting how, as a white person, you feel comfortable in spaces with a whole lot of different kinds of people, racial groups, ethnic groups, cultural groups, age groups, and that, your kid, as a kid who's going to be transracially adopted, now needs to be able to kind of see mirrors in a whole bunch of communities. Like they're growing up not in a family of color. So they need to be around and see adults who are transracially adopted and see that we turn out okay, that many of us are really all right. And, be able to have elders that are adult transracial adoptees to talk about, because that's the closest experience that they're going to have as a person of
Mhm.
color to what their experience is like. They need to be able to see adults who are their racial ethnic group, but were not transracially adopted, so that they can get a sense of, oh, if I wasn't adopted, this might be somebody who I could have related to in terms of their family experience. And I might want to learn culturally things from them that my parents can't teach me.
Mhm.
There can be all kinds of other ways in which your kid needs, mirrors of same age, both of kids that are similar races, but also who are also transracially adopted. So I think it's just really blowing up this idea of like, what are the mirrors? And there are, when you're transracially
Mhm.
adopted, there's like a bazillion more mirrors that you need and of many versions so that kids can also figure out, oh, I can be myself and I am transracially adopted and I am these races and I have a variety of ways in which that could happen for me. And I think what parents oftentimes do is we, have one Black person here, one Black person here, one Korean person here, and there's not a lot of versions of that for a young person. And so
Mhm.
they're kind of like, well, I can't be this. I'm not going to be this person. I don't really feel like I could be this person. And it creates all these unnecessary problems. And so I think parents need to think so much more diversely and complexly about what those mirrors are, and also present different versions of whiteness to their kid by being that themselves. White people have the capacity to not just stay in white bubbles and not stay in their comfort zones. And what does that look like for you? How willing are you to be the only in a place? How willing are you to not
Mhm.
have to drop your kid? I talked to somebody the other day and they're like, oh, they don't want me to drop them off at school, And I said, well, that's actually probably healthy, A, because they're a teenager and all kids are kind of that way, but B, because
Mhm.
they're trying to do their thing, without you ruining it. And I think it's hard for white people to think that their presence anywhere could ruin anything. And so to recognize that for your kid's healthy racial identity, having a white parent is a liability.
Mhm. Our transracially adopted children, I call it the umbrella. I didn't come up with that, but they're under the whiteness. They're under the umbrella of our family,
Yeah.
and the circles when they're younger, the circles we walk in and we move about in. Everybody knows that's Billy. He's
He's Dawn's kid.
yeah, he's Dawn's kid. But as our children start aging,
Mm-hmm.
then all of a sudden they have a life outside of us. And it's really hard when you are thinking of adopting a baby or a toddler or even a preschooler to remember that, because you think, well, as long as I'm around, but you won't always be,
Oh,
because they start joining a sports team that does, and then when they're young enough, this, you're still a part of it. But as they get older, you're not as much a part of everything. And especially when they go to college. And we hear of adoptees telling us that it's weird that they have pictures of their family, and then all of a
yeah.
sudden, and adoptees saying, sometimes I don't want to explain, I don't want to be the transracial adopted kid, so I take the pictures of my family down
Yes.
from my dorm room, because when somebody sees it, they go, oh, wait, who are those white people?
Yeah. And then it just changes everything.
Yeah. And I don't want to have to deal with that right now.
Yeah, and I think people got to be okay with that the moment of that is healthy. Now that's not okay to stay forever, in that space. But I think there's such politic in communities of color, and well, everywhere, about transracial adoption, that it's hard to explain to somebody who's white how good that feels to be in a space of people of color and be accepted on your own terms as fully a person of color. And to want that, and to want to have friendships with people that start from that place before you complicate it with, you have this other story, I think is a healthy thing initially. I think there's many of us have gone through that. And I guess I want parents to hear that there's aspects of that are incredibly healthy, no matter how much that might hurt to hear that you're not
To
there.
try not to take it personally and be
Yeah.
prepared. Can you talk a little more about the politics of transracial adoption in minority communities?
Yeah, well, transracial adoption has explicitly been used to displace children of color out of communities of color. So, particularly in the case of Black people and in case of Native American people. And one might even argue in the case of international adoption that there's just a lot of harm that's happened by using adoption and outplacing of children to resolve racial difference in our nation and to try to ameliorate that. And so those legacies of the use of children and removing of children and the lack of power and sanctity of a family's right, of a community's right to protect their own family as a family unit and hold that together, has been so violated in our country by the use of adoption and the relationship of taking children out of homes, that's a powerful understanding of what adoption is about. And when you are from one of those families, even if that is not specifically your story, even if the parent chose you as as an open adoption and the biological parents chose you as the family they wanted their child to be a part of, you still have to be ready for, now you've become part of a intentional or unintentional community of people who wear the label of, cultural genocide, displacement of children of color, et cetera. And so that oftentimes gets visited not on the white parents involved, but on the kid. And
Mm.
so when you say you're transracially adopted, I mean, some of the things that I've been asked when I was much younger, things like, does your mom make you do the laundry for the family? And I'm like, well, yeah, that's my chore. Yes, but not because I'm a slave, but because in my family, children aren't special and precious, and you're expected to like chip in and do the work. My extended family came from farming, and that was just the culture of it.
Hmm.
But, the way that my Black friends heard that was, my sister and I are doing laundry for our white mother.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so how do you argue that they're wrong in that without then seeming like you've been bamboozled and whitewashed into thinking that your
Hmm.
enslavement in this family is something you do by choice? So
Hmm.
I think a lot of white people just have no sensitivity to all the spaces and places that we go and have to explain
Hmm.
our families and both perform racial consciousness and awareness and talk about racism and be able to talk about racism and also hold this very intimate relationship that we have to whiteness, sometimes through our extended families biologically, for those of us who are mixed race, but also certainly from our adoptive families. And
Hmm.
how do we hold these two realities in different communities, and how you talk about your family in ways that aren't, naive.
Hmm. Or perceived as naive. Hmm.
Or perceived as naive. Yeah.
Hmm. Let me pause here to remind you, or to tell you if you don't know about it to begin with, that we have 12 free courses supported by the Jockey Being Family Foundation, and they're on the Creating a Family Online Education Center. They're 1 hour, they're self-paced, so you take them on your own. You can get a certificate of completion if you need it. If you don't, you can just take the course and learn something. The topics are all directly relevant for those who are actively parenting. I think you will love them. You can access them at bit.ly/JBF support. That's bit.ly/JBF support. So you are a researcher, and Creating a Family is certainly a research-based organization. So what does the research show on how transracially adopted kids are doing?
Well, I think, some of this research is complicated by the fact that we have no way to track who all is adopted. So it's sort of an impossibility to do research in other ways that maybe a public health scientist might, or a sociologist might, or somebody who has access to demographic data. There's such diversity in how people become adopted that some of this is tracked, some of this isn't. Race recording is very bad. So I just want to say that before I go spouting off about the research, to say that all of the research is done in the context of incredible limitations to really knowing even what the full universe of adoption looks like. How many transracial adoptions really are there? How many same race adoptions really are there? We actually don't know that exact number.
Yeah.
So I just want to say that for your listeners.
It's amazing. People don't believe me when I tell them, but we can make a guesstimate on just how many adoptions take place in the United States.
Yeah.
We know from foster care, and we know from international, but both of those are tracked. But for domestic infant, it is not.
It is not. And so if you're adopting domestically through a private agency, or you're adopting, which is increasingly true, independent of an agency, and it's just a brokering of an adoption attorney between a biological parent or biological parents and an adoptive parent, that's not recorded anywhere. So we have no way of knowing. And that's a huge slice of the pie of adoption. So I just want people to know that as I'm talking about research, all of this is research that's been done on smaller samples of voluntary folks that are involved in adoption, either through being the adoptive parent or being the adopted child. There are really only 2 attempts at truly national studies. One was the Survey of Adoptive Parents that was done by Evan B. Donaldson quite a while ago, and one that recently was launched by a colleague of mine, Holly McGinnis at VCU, who is attempting to do a national survey mapping adult adoptees, which is the first ever of its kind. Most studies of adoption stop in childhood, as though somehow when we are 18, we age out of adoption, and it's
right.
being
all the issues or anything are completely gone.
Are really gone. And so I'm really excited to see what Holly's work renders, because I think it's a really important look at what does adoption look like in your 50s, in your 60s, in your 70s. I think it's just going to provide some really important and critical insight. But here's what we know, that there are some things for which adopted children look very much the same as children who are not, particularly children who are adopted young and stay within that adoptive home, in terms of school achievement and socializing and bonding with parents and all these other sort of basic child developmental outcomes, that they oftentimes don't look much different. It is around these issues of identity, racial identity, depression, et cetera, that we start seeing some differences. So children who are adopted, whether transracial or same race, have a higher incident of suicidal ideation, mental health, particularly internalizing behaviors.
And by internalizing, you mean depression, anxiety, things such as that.
What I mean is, like, rather than acting out and saying, I'm mad, it would be externalizing. So getting your feelings out, externalizing behavior, versus internalizing behavior. You stay quiet, you don't say anything. And that oftentimes leads to things like depression, eating disorders, that sort of thing. And ultimately, oftentimes is a precursor or associated with suicide. So there is a study that folks did outside the US that followed adoptees starting from birth. Most of that sample was children who have been adopted before the age of 9 months. And even later in life into their 20s, they exhibited a more than 30% higher rates, 3 times higher rate than non-adopted persons for suicide. And this only started to level out in people's late adulthood, meaning like age 35, 30, 40. So that's a long time to be developing and experiencing mental health risk and suicide risk. That sort of
Mhm.
debunks some of this. Adolescence is the only big time for which there's turbulence in a child's life, but that there's also I think for adopted people, as you intimated earlier, whether it's college or just leaving home, but that kind of emerging adult period of 18 to 25 is another period of time where for many of us, that is their first time to really actually experience a context outside of the bubble that their parents have beautifully orchestrated for them. And a lot of things happen, a lot of identity stuff, beautiful identity work can happen, and a lot of very hurtful identity work can happen. A lot of searches for biological families happen during that time. And unfortunately, there aren't a lot of supports for adopted people to go to be held during those times. And so there's also a lot of turbulence that can happen in the adoptive family. So I think that's one thing that comes out. I think the other thing that comes out really clearly is that as much as has changed, I think, around the white parents who are adopting children of color, and that there's this podcast, there are other podcasts, people who have written, those of us who are adult adoptees have written things and are writing memoirs and documentaries. So there's just so much more than there used to be, even just 30 years ago. So there's just so much more material, culture camps, et cetera, that still the issues that continue to come up with every generation, kind of the same. It's white parents not getting race, white parents waiting too long to talk to their kids about race, white parents being insecure about open adoptions and relationships with their cultures and communities of origin, or literally their birth parents. It's like these same kind of issues. So I think that continues to be true. Kreider, and I'm going to forget the other name, but I cite this in some of my work often. They did a study on the census about, are transracial adoptive families more like multiracial families, or are they more like white families in terms of the choices they make as to where they live and that sort of thing. And what they found is that out of all the different configurations of family, particularly white couples who had adopted Asian kids live in whiter places than even white people do for the same socioeconomic rung. And so this just sort of race to whiteness continues among a big group, a substantial group of white parents still, even despite what we know in research that would suggest that delaying, denying, or distorting in some way the centrality of race in a person of color's life is developmentally harmful. We have all kinds of research, even on not transracial adoptees, but just research on child development that suggests that positive racial identity, parenting, and racial socialization is critical for children of color. And that doesn't go away when a child is adopted by a white person. And if anything, it becomes more intense. It becomes more important even. And so I think research suggests that we still have not done an adequate job by transracial adoptees in finding policies and practices that ensure that the families that they're going to grow up with get that and are prepared to do that kind of parenting on top of all the things that parents also have to be attuned to.
Mhm. I was glad you raised the issue of openness in adoption, and you were saying it not specific to transracial. You were saying in general, adoptive parents struggling with openness. But what issues may come up with open adoption when you adopt across racial lines?
Mm-hmm. I think some of the ways in which white folks might think about a Black mother or a Black father, there's racism oftentimes as a part of that, which is different than maybe the narratives we might use for how a white person becomes pregnant and decides to adopt. And so I think there's a lot of fear sometimes about who those folks are, especially among adopters that don't have friends and connections with people of color from their child's communities, that racialization and racism of ways in which they think about adults from their child's community of color oftentimes shadow how they understand that biological parent before they ever know that parent at all, or know what
Mhm.
so there's oftentimes this heightened conversation about fear of like the person coming into the house or doing something dangerous. And so that isn't always quite so pronounced and palpable, I think, in oftentimes white families who are adopting white children and open to openness. So I would say that's the biggest one in terms of just openness. And I think that's why some people find international adoption really attractive, because there's less of a possibility of that biological parent coming from nowhere and there's a lot greater distance there. So the
Mhm.
boundary is bigger, and it feels a little more protected in terms of the roles that folks will have.
And in some ways, it gets confused because there's also very often a socioeconomic difference, a class difference
Yeah.
between the adoptive family and the biological family. And that interplays as well. And it interplays with race as well. And I think one of the distinctions is that families oftentimes just don't know families of color. They don't. And so what seems alien to them is just actually cultural, or that's where their family, that's common in that family. And this is particularly if you're having an ongoing, which is what we hope for families, an ongoing relationship through openness, where as the child ages, there's more interaction, and it is other, and it feels other.
Yeah.
And you have to make the effort to not view other as bad. Other is different.
Yeah. Because this other created your child.
Yes.
Like we know this with regard to research of a divorce, that it is wildly harmful for parents to pathologize the other parent with their child. It's just incredibly, devastatingly harmful, no matter how awful this person was to be partnered with. It is damaging to that child to hear pejorative things said about one of their parents. And it is the same thing for an adoptive child to hear horrible things about the people that created them, that where they are from, who they are biologically tied to, related to, whether they ever meet them at all. And so I think it would behoove us to use some of the research that we already have about how children grow up in healthy ways when they come from complex family structures of separation, divorce, even when there's been no marriage, like what is healthy co-parenting, and whether you ever have an open adoption literally, or you're just able to be open about talking about this other parent who you will never meet. There are ways that you need to think from the child's perspective of, this is the person that they are biologically related to. And this child will internalize everything that you say about them as potentially, this is who they really are, whether you say it that way or not. And so to have incredible thought and care about how you are framing, you can think whatever you think, but like how you're framing this to your child, this is their heritage that you're talking about, and their biological parent. And it has a proximity to them that I think a lot of adoptive parents may not be as sensitive to as they should be.
The last thing I want to cover is hair care and skin care. And that preparation for transracial adoption goes way beyond hair and skincare. I think that sometimes we do focus, especially in the last 10 years, there's been a tremendous amount of focus on that. And I don't want to leave the impression that that is the only thing that one needs to consider when you're considering whether you're the right family to adopt across racial lines.
Right.
However, hair and skincare are important. And I think they're often very important, particularly in the Black community.
Yeah.
And so we do need to talk about that. So what does hair and skincare mean within, and perhaps within other racial communities as well, but certainly within the Black community? What place does that have? And what does that mean? What should parents, prospective adoptive parents, know about that?
Yeah. Well, it's another way in which people from communities of color judge you. It's just kind of like looking at your kid, they can tell whether or not you're doing a whole bunch of other stuff or not.
Do you mean judging adoptive parents, or you mean judging each other?
Judging the adoptive parents. So, it's like, when I used to interview people early in my dissertation, one of the very number one things that the adults talked to me about was hair care and how embarrassing it was for them to run around. And when they'd pass a Black person, the Black person would either say something about their hair to their parents, or roll their eyes, or shake their head, like, here goes another one. It's really considered a form of physical neglect to not have your child. It'd be like in the white community, never washing your hair, ever.
Well, having tangled and
tangled and matted up hair that you never brush.
Matted up hair, yeah, just unkempt hair, yeah.
Grooming neglect. It's just unexcusable. And particularly now where there's so many YouTube videos and hair products, even at Target, there's just no excuse for kids running around with what we might call jacked up hair. So and if you don't know, go to a beauty salon, a black beauty salon, and have people teach you how to do basic stuff and take your child to a professional. It's sort of one of those things where it's a marker in the Black community for all kinds of other cultural disconnections that you probably have. So if you don't have the hair right, it's kind of like you probably are doing all kinds of other stuff or not doing all kinds of other stuff. But yes, just doing hair is not sufficient. So it's sort of like it's one of those things that you just should be doing. It's not even something we should be in this day and age even talking about anymore. However, in addition to that, thinking through like, how are you exposing your kids to all kinds of ways in which they can be engaging and developing friendships and participating in culture? Like culture of origin shouldn't be something that's an event in your family where everybody loads in the car once a year to go to African World Fest, or once a year you go to culture camp, but then the rest of your existence is in white land. Like that's just that's so imbalanced. It should almost be like the opposite. To actually counter, that's like how much is needed to counter all of the whiteness that we all get exposed to daily. So it's almost like you need to overdo whether your kid likes it or not. And it should be natural. It shouldn't be like an event that everybody has to do. It should just be how you live every day and not a conversation, but just how, I oftentimes liken this to religion. Like if you're a particular religion, you don't wait till they're 18 to tell them,
You also don't just do it at Christmas and Easter.
Yes, it's the same thing. If you expect that your child is going to have a relationship to this, then you have to do it like that much.
And going back to hair care, let me mention that it's also possible, there is so much emphasis now in the transracial adoption community on you got to get the hair right.
Yeah.
But you can also go overboard. And I will use an example of a mom of I think her daughter was in first grade, and she had elaborate braids and was spending a lot of time. And her daughter hated it, and it became a battle. And this was in our online support group, and one of the Black moms in the group said, well, have you thought about just doing simple braids with barrettes at the end? It doesn't have to be so. I mean, her daughter's, the first mom's daughter's hair was beautiful, but it was very time consuming, and the daughter hated it.
Yeah.
So I assumed that she then just kind of moved to a much simpler. The first mom said, but the problem is I know that everybody is looking. My kid has to have better everything, has to have, we can't run around with clothes with a hole in the knee.
Right.
Because people are going to judge me.
Yeah. And like some of that is true. I mean, Black parents do the same thing about, you have to look better and be smarter and work twice as hard. So I think, there is truth to that people are watching, and you do kind of have to be attuned to that. And Black parents tell their kids, my white mother made it very clear to me that I would not get second chances, that I was not going to be given the benefit of the doubt. When I showed up somewhere, I needed to look a particular way because people probably weren't going to take me seriously anyway. And especially wouldn't if I showed up presenting myself in a particular way. And yet there's also a way in which overindulging that can make for a very highly anxious parenting style and make for a very unhealthy way of moving through the world. So I think it's a balance of knowing that and making some choices, but not overdoing, because at the end of the day, you're going to be judged anyway. Whether your kid's hair is perfect and you got the best braids or whatever, like you're already going to be judged anyway. So kind of pick your battles and figure out what areas you're going to just be the queen of braiding or whatever it's going to be.
And if your kid hates it, do simpler braids.
Yeah, just simple braids. How about that? Like, you don't have to be perfect. You just your kid has to have their hair combed. And that's all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gina Samuels, for being with us today to help us understand what families should consider if they're considering transracial adoption. We truly appreciate your expertise.
Absolutely. Happy to be here, Dawn.
Before you leave, let me say one last shout out to Children's Connection. They have been such a long-term supporter of our nonprofit and a supporter of this show. They have just been wonderful for us. I want you to know about them. They are an adoption agency providing services for domestic infant adoption, placing babies throughout the U.S. They also do home studies and post-adoption support for families in Texas.